This story all started with a load of crap, literally. My wife past weekend had made arrangements to go to a horse stable to pick up a load of horse manure. When we got there, the fellow that owns the place, he's quite an interesting character. We hit it off right away, and we started talking about genealogy and history. His name's Marc Bastarache, and that's where I'm headed this bright and early Wednesday morning. It's funny that the places you go and the people you meet unexpectedly can have such great stories. And it's because these are their family stories. I'm really excited to get to know him better and looking forward to talking with him and finding out more about him and his family story and how he got here. So here we are at Venture Stables. One thing that's interesting about Marc, besides running the stables, he also fixes violins. He restores them. Quite old and valuable ones, I understand. And hi, I'm here today with Marc Bastarache. Am I saying that name right, Marc?
Yeah, you are.
And so, Marc, just tell me a little bit about yourself, and then tell me how you got interested in genealogy. And
sure. So I'm Marc Bastarache, and really, I guess if we want to talk about genealogy, we can start with my last name. We can get to my first name later, but my last name is kind of what sparks the interest in this conversation. So what really got me interested in genealogy was I'm Acadian. Is my ancestry, so that's my background. But clearly I speak English. So I grew up in a French Acadian-speaking region, except English was my language of preference. And the other surnames in the area would have been like Comeau or Saunier or Thériault, Robichaud, Leblanc, all of those ones. And with the handle of Basterash, I started noticing it didn't really fit in. It didn't match that pattern. So, for most of my life, I was curious as to what this name was that I kept signing. And when I started digging in, I found a whole bunch of interesting stuff. So it just kind of sucked me in. Yeah.
Genealogy has a way of doing that, doesn't it?
Definitely does.
Once you start down one path, it can lead to so many more.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were Acadian. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in southwest Nova Scotia, so in the municipality of Clare. It's known as the Acadian Shore down there. Clare is a conglomeration of probably 30-ish communities, mostly along the shore, along St. Mary's Bay. But there's some inland stuff there too. No, that's where I grew up. My mom was from Clare. She's a Thériault. Her last name's Thériault. And my father, Basterash, was from Bouctouche, from the Sainte Marie de Kent region, Kent County, New Brunswick. So they met back in the 70s. And next thing you know, they had some babies, and that's me. So I got this handle of Basterash, and just curious what it was. I heard all the jokes, of course. I might as well start with that because, you ask somebody and they'll say, oh, it just means bastard child. Or so I thought, well, that's possible too. And then I had all the other names, backslash, backscratch, balderdash. And then there's the different spellings, Pasterash, Vasterash, a whole bunch of different ones. So all my life I was really curious as what it really was. And then, of course, this wonderful invention of the internet shows up, and the flow of information starts going. So I was able to start looking into it over the last few years.
When you started looking into it a little farther, what did you discover?
I discovered that in the name itself, there was an amazing story of arrival and survival, I guess. The story starts with a man named Johannes, who was from the Basque country, who ends up in Acadia in 1681. He shows up into Port Royal, came from Bayonne, We don't know exactly how he got here or why he got here. Those are things I'm trying to find. But we do know that he shows up in 1681 at the age of 23 or 24 years old. From the Basque country. Now, the Basque country doesn't exist anymore. It's this old country or a country or a nation, or however you want to talk about it, because the way that these entities were formed in those days it was a little different. But so it existed basically on the border between France and Spain. There's still a huge Basque population there now. There's even a separatist Basque movement going on right now. The Basque region lies in that area of Europe, kind of surrounded by the Pyrenees Mountains. The Bay of Biscay is there. An interesting population on its own. The Basque language, for example, is considered a language isolate, so it's not related to any other European languages. It's totally not related to anything else in Europe. Yeah, so it doesn't have Latin roots, it doesn't have Greek roots, it doesn't have any of those roots. It's its own thing. The Pyrenees Mountains and the Bay of Biscay and the ingenuity of the Basques over the years meant that they didn't need to go outside of their own region. The Romans came in for a little bit, but they didn't do well in the Basque region. The Basques had their spot figured out. They were the whalers. They were ship-going people starting into the 15th, 16th century. They were some of the first travelers to come west to North America after the Vikings, and we see evidence in that all the time. Newfoundland, Port au Basque. So that's where the Basque whalers would go. And even to this day, you can go to the beaches, the rocky beaches. They're not much fun to go to, but you can find remnants of the whale oil rendering stations that they had, because they would come over with their whale ships in the spring and go home with the whale meat, oil, and products in the fall before the winter from Newfoundland. But to come over with an empty ship, you needed to bring ballast. So what they would bring was clay roofing tiles. And they'd use their clay roofing tiles to make the rendering facilities over there in Newfoundland on the shores. So you can still find red clay tile from the 1500s all over the shores of Newfoundland now. And that's from the original Basque groups coming through.
Johann, you said that he was here in Port Royal.
Mm-hmm.
So how did he make it out of Port Royal? Was he still there when the English laid siege and took it over?
Yeah, he was. He's still there. He's still buried there in the old cemetery.
Okay.
Unmarked grave. The Acadians didn't have value enough to have marked graves once the British came in and gone. So the garrison graveyard in Annapolis Royal is marked for the British soldiers and the British people, but there's a subsection that is known that it's there. They've done some ground penetrating radar in the last few years, so they know where the graves are, but we don't know who and where. But no, so he ended up there. The quote-unquote British siege of Annapolis, I think it actually turned hands, a total of 10 times. Yeah. Right? So some was British, some was New England. Argall came from New England, and there's a whole bunch of things that happened there. But so no, Johannes Basque, as he was known in the first times, because he didn't have the name of Basterash necessarily right away. The name Basterash, to just break that apart quickly, comes from the Basque meaning of it's the man from the house on the corner or the frontier. So it's kind of a little non-specific, but it's what it means. It still exists in the Basque region now. You can find the name, except it's spelled a little differently. The Basque way of spelling is they use a lot of X's, Bastarache. Okay. So he shows up in Port Royal in 1681, gets married that year to Anne Godin, and immediately starts having Catholic children. So his first son was named Pierre. They ended up settling in what was known as the high water, the highest navigable waters of what was then the Dauphin River, which is now the Annapolis River. The community that exists today around the old Basterash hamlets would be Bridgetown. Okay. Bridgetown, Carleton Corner, in Paradise specifically. So the original name of the community of Paradise in the French times was Paradis Terrestre, earthly paradise. It would have been at the slowest moving point of this tidal river, nestled between two soft valleys, and the Annapolis Valley is a beautiful place. So they definitely saw it as an earthly paradise. So that's where they made their home in those early times.
Okay. And so from there, people that aren't familiar with the story of the Acadian deportation, that would have affected him at one point. So explain that and how that affected him.
Sure, very much. So the Acadian deportation is basically it's a 6, if I'm not mistaken, from 55 to 63. So yeah, so it's a few years of tumultuous times there. But to describe the deportation for people that aren't completely familiar with it, is this region of the Maritimes, what we consider now Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, PEI, New Brunswick, even parts of Maine and into the Gaspé, were hotly contested between a few groups of people. Most commonly you'll hear English and French, the British and the French, but we have to include the other people that were here before those people showed up, which is the native populations, largely the Mi'kmaq, and what became the Acadian people. The Acadian people weren't like made overnight. They evolved into this population that was separate from the French and separate from the Mi'kmaq, but unique in their own existence. So to get to the deportation, the Acadians started in the 1600s, early 1600s, as they began to become, but their heyday would have been in the 1680s, 90s, into the 1720s, into the 30s. As you get past the 1730s, the tensions between the French and the British become really tight. So they're fighting over this part of the world. Basically, it's part of the New England expansion. The New England colonies had they weren't able to move west over the Appalachian Mountains. So their best option was to move north. And there was this French sympathetic, Catholic, Mi'kmaq-friendly population that was in the way. They had built a great agrarian society, and those are the Acadians. So for that, the New England expansion, we had to displace them. So this is what we talk about, the deportation. So to get back to the Basterash in Johannes, in his earthly paradise with his young children and his son Pierre and his wife Anne, how does he end up through this story? So being close to Annapolis Royal, which Fort Anne was the British fort there, the closer you were to the fort, the more prickly the British were. So you found Acadian settlements starting to be further away from the British power in Annapolis. So you find at where Basterash settled, at the high part of the river, and then you start getting these other populations that pop up, mainly around the Wolfville area, which is known today. So like Grand Prairie, and the Minas Basin area. And Beaubassin, which is right today is basically the border between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So those areas didn't have a huge British presence. No, it wasn't much there. So you found the population around Annapolis slowly, over the years, moving and getting out of town effectively. So that's what Jean did with his wife and children. So at one point he ends up in and around Sackville, New Brunswick today, which was the community of Beaubassin. And of course, Beaubassin is a French word that means beautiful basin, which it was. It was well protected from the weather in the Bay of Fundy, but it still had the tidal advantages that the Acadians liked so much, so they could do their diking systems and build a strong agrarian society. So he ends up in Beaubassin, amongst a bunch of others. A lot of this had to do with getting away from the British, like I said, and crossing over into a more French-controlled, Acadian-friendly territory. There was a lot of involvement here with the Catholic Church and some missionaries. One missionary in particular named Louis Le Loutre, Abbé Le Loutre, which Le Loutre means the fox. So that's pretty appropriate for this guy. But so eventually the Basterash end up there. Old Jean doesn't get there. He dies in, if I'm not mistaken, 1724 in Annapolis. These records still exist. The church records from that parish exist. They're in Clare, where I grew up at the St. Anne's University, in the archives there. But I guess it's his son Pierre, the eldest, ends up in Beaubassin. Now at this time we're into the 1730s and 40s. It's getting tight. It's getting tense. The British are putting pressure. There's whispers of displacing these inconvenient French Acadians, all against the wish of the British powers, the Board of Trade in England. They saw the Acadians as an asset, possibly a trouble, but at this point still an asset. They were providing a lot of food to the garrison in Annapolis. They were also providing sustenance to Louisbourg and the French. The Acadians didn't necessarily see themselves on one side or the other. They always saw themselves as neutral, but they saw themselves in a position where they could help the economy everywhere. So they would trade with Mi'kmaq, they trade with the British, they trade with the French, they trade with who anybody would do business with them. They saw themselves as sovereign, effectively. It's not a good thing to do in those times. It's because it brought about their demise. So Pierre the Senior ends up in Beaubassin. He has a son who he names Pierre as well. So there's Pierre Jr., Pierre the Second. He grows up in these times where I can only imagine, as a young adult growing up, he hears the whispers, he sees the tensions going on, the skirmishes. And in the years leading up to the final decision in 1755 to effectively displace this entire population, at some point, Pierre and some of his compatriots, some of his friends, which we know in Acadian folklore, in the history, is like the Broussard family, Beausoleil-Broussard, which is another man who shows up in history. We can talk about later, but he's effectively a captain in the Acadian militia. So there is a resistance to the British forces that's actively put together, led by this Le Loutre, the priest I was telling you about earlier. Sympathetic to the French, he was, but they wanted to keep Acadie the way it was. So Pierre II, his brother Michel, and a bunch of others in the Beaubassin area put up a big fight. So they end up becoming part of the resistance, largely fueled by Acadian and Mi'kmaq personnel. It's funded and sanctioned by the government out of Quebec and the Catholic Church through Le Loutre. And in the spring of 1755, Pierre II ends up being taken prisoner, I guess, for a better way of saying it, in the Beaubassin area. And he was taken prisoner with how did they call it? It was some of the most unruly and most dangerous enemy, is what they said at the time. So they were imprisoned in Fort Cumberland, which was renamed Fort Cumberland after the British took over. It was Fort Beausejour before that, and that's the fort that's on the New Brunswick side of the border today. There was a British fort that opposed it, Fort Lawrence, which is on the Nova Scotia side. It's no longer there, but they ended up tearing that down to build the pieces of Fort Cumberland after the siege in 1755. So after 1755, after the siege and the fall of Fort Beausejour, Pierre II is taken prisoner. They are immediately put on one of the transport ships for fear of an uprising. They're actually the first group to be deported, to be sent off. It was the first ship to go. If we follow the New England story of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, it sounds like a lot of this happened in Grand Pré. You hear of the deportation, the Evageline story is in Grand Pré, but the first ship to actually leave with prisoners on it was out of Beaubassin, and it was sent to the furthest colony south as possible. They wanted them as far away from here, so they sent them to Charleston, South Carolina. And that was in the fall of 1755, in October. Once this group of unruly Acadians gets to South Carolina, it's a little unclear whether, because there's mixed stories. The governor in South Carolina didn't want these prisoners. He's like, why did you send me these prisoners? I have trouble. Now what am I going to do with them? So some were released, were given free passage to do what they want. Some escaped. I'm still drilling into the story to see if these ones were given free passage or if they were allowed to escape, or if they escaped. But either way, they were free. So in the spring of 1756, Pierre the Senior ends up setting off on foot with 15 compatriots, 15 people, and they want to come home. Now we're talking from Charleston, South Carolina, 1756, in the middle of a war between the French and the English. So they set off on foot in the spring, and they eventually make their way to the shores of Lake Ontario. So they have to cross through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, the state of New York, and they eventually get to the shores of Lake Ontario. When they get to Lake Ontario, they are unfortunately cross paths with a group of British-friendly Mohawk natives, probably Iroquois. I'm still trying to dig in to see exactly where this happened and who the probable group was. Of course, the notes will say Indians, but it's known that the Iroquois were somewhat sympathetic with the British, so it's probably them. They were taken hostage. The group was taken hostage, tortured. 2 of the people in the group died because of the wounds inflicted on them. But there was a fur trader from Quebec that either was summoned or happened upon this group. He was able to negotiate the ransom that their captives were demanding. So he paid the ransom and freed the remaining 11 or 12 or 13 of this group that was traveling. So now they're free, but they still have to get back home. They were looking for their wives and their children, who I haven't mentioned at this point, but they were left behind in all of this. They didn't get on a ship. So somehow throughout this story, before these prisoners left, they were given a compass from somebody in the Petitcodiac region, so around the area of current-day Moncton. Somehow this compass survived the trip to South Carolina, and they used the compass to navigate their way home. So when they were finally freed from their captives, they were able to use the canoes from their rescuer, and they made their way back to La Mer Rouge, the Red Sea, which is known as the Northumberland Strait. It was the original name for the Northumberland Strait. And there, they heard whispers of refugee camps. One of them on Ile Saint-Jean, which is currently today's Prince Edward Island. And the other refugee camp that was set up that they heard about was on the Miramichi. It was run by a commander, Boisébert, out of Quebec. Boisébert, today you can find his refugee camp still exists, but the name has changed and turned anglicized a little bit, and it's Beaubear's Island. Beaubear's Island is on the Miramichi River. It's up the Miramichi River a little bit. So Pierre and Michel had heard about these 2 refugee camps and that there was thousands of Acadians here, that they were in horrible condition. France lost the war. Sorry to break it's a spoiler alert, but France lost the war. So in losing these wars, you end up with diminishing resources. So Boisébert's refugee camp and the one here on Prince Edward Island were way undersupplied. They had such a hard time getting resources here, so hundreds and hundreds of people died. So Pierre and Michel were hopeful that they could find their families, but it was probably just a hope. But through some miracle or whatever you want to call it, they end up back here alive, the two brothers, and they find their wives. Michel finds his wife on PEI, Prince Edward Island, and gathers his children and his wife and ends up back in New Brunswick, on the shores of New Brunswick. And Pierre finds his wife Anne and his children and his little son Isidore at Boisebert's camp in the Miramichi. Now I mentioned the son Isidore because Isidore was born in 1752. So it's 3 years before this time, 3 years before the deportation. So I can't help but imagine what it's like to be a 3-year-old running away from the home that you know. Your father is put on a prison ship, sent off to God knows where. Whether or not you're going to see him again, who knows? Cannon fire, ships in the basin, people running everywhere. Everything's unknown. So what did Anne and her little son Isidore go through? I can only imagine. Somehow they end up from Beaubassin through eastern channels. They end up on the eastern shore of New Brunswick, of what was then Acadie or Nova Scotia, as it was often written, l'Acadie or Nova Scotia. So they end up there. But it makes me wonder, what pathways did they take? Who helped them? How much Mi'kmaq involvement here was there? Is this two people helping each other survive? But they end up over there. Isidore is the little secret in my personal family line. When you ask me about genealogy, he's the boy that makes me curious, because somehow he ends up surviving. So he's 3 years old in 1755. 1763 is when peace, quote unquote, is finally found. He's 11 years old then. That must have imprinted him immensely. So for the next few years, they're still bouncing around from community to community. The Acadians are still unwanted, even though they're allowed to be here. As settlements pop up throughout that area, what is currently known between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, this family was displaced about 5 or 6 times. They were in Cap Maringouin. I don't even know how you say that in English now. It's Mosquito Cape, but Cap Maringouin, I think it's still called that now. They were there for a while. They were in the Beaubassin area. They were on the run until about the 1770s, where they finally settle. Pierre the Elder settles in what is now Bucktush, New Brunswick, and Michel, his brother, settles in Tracadie, and that's where they finally settle down. Isidore grows old, has a family, has children. They have children, and then you end up eventually with Marc sitting in Freetown, PEI, in front of a microphone talking to Brian. So Acadians, to tell our story, we have a specific way. We just do it with our names. So my father's name was Gerald. So I am Marc, a Gerald. His father's name was Joseph. So to tell my entire story, it's Marc, a Gerald, a Joseph, a Athanase, a Isidore, a Pierre, a Jean. And that's my whole family line. So I have 2 Athanase and 2 Pierre, and 1 Isidore.
At which point did the Acadians start to, I guess, feel more invested, accepted within the greater community that was now British, but soon would be shortly after distinguished as being not American British.
Yes.
More British North American still. At which point did I want to say assimilate, but that it became that they weren't as much a concern to the British forces that were still here. I know that during the American Revolution, there was always the fear that, especially when studying Canadian history, you learn about the fear that they had of uprisings in Quebec, which never happened because there was a lot of accommodation and a lot of appeasement, I guess, to try to prevent that. Did that come shortly thereafter for the Acadians? I know we talked before we started that was still some prejudice, the French prejudice in looking for jobs in non-French areas if you had a French name, which is one of the reasons many Acadian names have been anglicized. And
I feel like it's difficult to generalize, honestly, because from the beginning there was Acadians that were British sympathizers.
Yeah.
There was Acadians that were French sympathizers, and I don't think that ever really stopped.
Yeah.
Ever. The Nova Scotia government plan, which was the Nova Scotia Council, the Halifax Council, once in 1763, after the, I think it's Aix La Chapelle, the wording of the allowing of the return of the Acadians was very clear. The purpose was to never let an Acadia form again. However, they were willing to allow Acadian families back, but no more than 10 families in a group in one community, and no more than 1,000 people in one community. They didn't want them to coalesce again. So if you look at the map today and look at where you find Acadian regions, a lot of times they're separated by English regions. Like where I grew up in the southwest Nova Scotia, our municipality, which is all Acadian, is Clare, which is interesting because it's named after County Clare, Ireland. And I think that's a little twist of ironic humor, how you can tell Acadians you're allowed to live there, but we're going to call it Clare. And then you can tell the Acadians you can live in this other community over here, but we're going to call that one Argyle. So interestingly, and here on PEI, one of the Acadian regions is named Wellington. So it's almost this little twist of humor that they've done. But so was there ever really an assimilation or that? I want to say no. The reason I say that is because there was a dark period in Acadian history where their identity wasn't. It was about survival for them. They didn't have any symbolism. They didn't have any cohesiveness. The Acadian flag, as we know it today, wasn't a thing. That only comes out in the 1880s. So you end up with this about 120-year period where they're just kind of in the backwoods. They don't involve themselves very much. They're self-sustained. They turn into farmers again and fishermen, depending on where they're at, loggers, boat builders. But they stay outside of the economy largely until really the turn of the 1900s. Yeah.
Now, my viewers that are from Canada probably are familiar with Acadians well through Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's story of Evageline, but also the Cajun population.
Yes.
Have you been able to find any of your own connections to the Cajuns?
Sure. So my journey so far in genealogy has been following this specific line that leads to me sitting here talking to you, which is through that direct line of descendants. I haven't really explored too much beyond that because this individual line is so rich in treasures that I haven't looked outside that yet. But I know that there will be some distant cousins that end up through this migratory path into Louisiana for sure. But just to talk about that for a little bit though, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1847, publishes the poem Evageline. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is a New Englander through and through. He hears the story of this population up north that gets displaced. Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of his friends. And so they apparently had a few evenings where they chatted about this story. So this is in 1847 that he publishes it. I think he started writing it in 1842, if I'm not mistaken. But at this point, Louisiana has Cajuns in it. Of course, Louisiana is in the States, and it's named after King Louis, which was the Louis of France. But throughout a big chunk of history, Louisiana territory was under Spanish control. in and about the time of the deportation and just after that, so 1755, 1760s, you end up with France or Spain quietly giving the Louisiana territory to France. It's a trade-off there. 1755, you end up with a massive displaced population. Tens of thousands of Acadians are moved around. The deportation itself, there was dozens and dozens of ships that carried thousands of Acadians from their homeland away. Most of the ships ended up in the British colonies in New England, Virginia, Maryland, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, the Carolinas. However, there is a group of people that end up as unknown. So they end up in France. Eventually ended up in France, but they're on British ships because they're taken by the British. So are they prisoners of war? Are they refugees? But they end up in England. A lot of them end up just being stuck in warehouses in Southampton, in Liverpool. They're bounced from one place to another. The British government has to feed them. Because if they're prisoners of war, there's a responsibility there. And if they're refugees, there's a responsibility there too. So the British government, after a while, says this is starting to get expensive. It had been, at this point, over 140 years before any original descendants from France came. However, England viewed these people as French people. So they said, fine, we'll send them to France. We'll give them back to their home country, even though their home country was in North America. So they end up in France. At this point, the government of France says, the powers in France says, hey, again, these are people we need to sustain. They're on the dole. So then Louisiana territory pops up. So they said, great. So we can now move these people who are searching for a home to this new land where they can actually give them and grant them land, acres, so they can return to their way of living. However, this only happens 25, 35 years after 1755. We're into the 1780s here. So the Cajuns, the name Cajun, of course, comes from Acadian. You end up with that. The people who become the Cajuns didn't come directly from here. They spent 30 years being bounced around, having babies, getting married, dying over in Europe. Some in England, in Southampton, in Liverpool, in the warehouses on the docks, and some of them under the government of France at the time. So when France was able to send them to Louisiana, they gave them land, and they were finally allowed to have a home. There had been some Acadians that had left Acadie in 1720s to head down into the Bayou region, so there was a few families there ahead of time. But the major population that became Cajuns was 30 years-ish after the deportation itself. So that's one of the reasons why they differentiate themselves so much from the northern cousins here, or the Acadians from the north, is their story is vastly different. The beginning of their story is the same, but how they end up there is very, very different than how you end up with the pockets of Acadian settlers here in Canada in the Maritimes.
Yeah, they must really feel like an unwanted people in the sense they weren't wanted to stay in Acadie, and they weren't wanted to stay in England. They weren't wanted to stay even French, which, the English and had assumed, well, that's their nationality. They're French, but
it's more of an unloading of a problem than it really was. Let's do the good thing. For sure. I'm pretty sure that once these people showed up in the bayous in Louisiana after spending 3 decades in urban settings as effectively they're some type of prisoner. Yeah. They were taken from their hamlets. They were taken from their home. These people had been in Acadia for generations at this point. So I'm sure when they showed up in the bayous of Louisiana, the old men that showed up there would have been young men when they left their original homeland. And the young men that showed up in Louisiana would have known nothing of the old Acadie. So they would have only known the docks and wharfs of Europe, and warehouses and slum living and living on the dole effectively. So when they showed up in Louisiana, they didn't have the tidal marshes that their ancestors knew. Their agrarian ways of society had been gone. They had been displaced for 3 decades. So it's the culture that evolved from that definitely has some energy, and their food is amazing. They've got a crazy energy, but that comes from the mixture of peoples that were there. They mixed with the Creole population. So there was Creoles coming from the Caribbean, and their language and food customs mixed with this people that basically had only language but no food customs at this point. So they had to create from the beginning to create a Cajun, which is why a Cajun is very different than what an Acadian is. However, they come from the same seed.
Yeah. Same names.
Same names most of the time. Yep. You'll find some family variations that are very much Louisiana names, and you'll find similarities up here in the north, as we were talking offline earlier. But some of the spellings you'll notice are very different. Like in Louisiana, you find Thibodeau often spelled with an X. That has more to do with the census taker than it does to do with the differentiating of the populations. But the census taker in Louisiana tended to write an X when you wanted to make that O sound, AUX. So there's a lot of families that still have that there that you won't find in the northern Acadie.